Stalin versus the Tsar's secret police, the birth of a tyrant. There were nights, in the crumbling alleys of old Tiflis, when Joseph Dzhugashvili, long before the world would know him as Stalin, felt the weight of footsteps that were not there. The lamplight flickered in the rain, and every sound in the narrow streets seemed to echo with intent, as if someone, somewhere, had whispered his name to the wrong ears. At 23, he had already learned that in the Tsar's empire, silence was never just silence. It was a curtain stretched over fear, and fear was the only language the Tsar's secret police, the Okhrana, needed to speak. On those nights, Stalin moved like a shadow trying to outrun another shadow. Every door he passed felt like it could fly open and disgorge uniformed men with pale faces, black coats, and the cold authority of the empire. It wasn't courage that kept him moving. It was a growing hardness in his chest, a decision he had made quietly but permanently. Trust no sound, trust no face, trust no one. Imperial Russia in the early 1900s was not a country. It was a prison with borders, Siberian exile ships drifting across frozen rivers, secret informants in every tavern, agents with notebooks and gold coins hidden inside their coats. A man could be arrested for a sentence spoken too loudly or a sentence whispered too softly. Stalin grew up in this world like a sapling growing between stones, learning early that softness snapped easily. His city, Tiflis, hummed with conspirators, workers, priests, thieves, every one of them watching the corners of their eyes. The Okhrana fed on this tension. They cultivated it. They amplified it. If a revolutionary cell collapsed, the agents celebrated. If a family tore itself apart over suspicion, they encouraged the rumor. Young Stalin didn't fear the Okhrana because they were powerful. He feared them because they understood human weakness. And so, to survive them, he taught himself to abandon weakness entirely. The Okhrana first learned his name when he was barely 17, not because he had set off bombs or robbed trains yet, but because he had a talent for stirring the wrong minds. He wrote poems that were more dangerous than pistols. He delivered speeches that made factory workers whisper about the world that might exist beyond the Tsar's shadow. Even then, the Okhrana had dossiers on boys like him, dreamers, thinkers, troublemakers. But as Stalin slipped deeper into the world of underground Marxist circles, the Okhrana began to see a different shape forming around him. Not a dreamer, but a man who could disappear at will. He changed safehouses like changing shirts. He memorized routes through the city that police patrols never used. He learned to burn documents before knocking on a door. And somewhere in this early dance between hunter and hunted, Stalin discovered the cold pleasure of outlasting those who wanted him caught. By the time he became a full-time revolutionary, paranoia had already taken root inside him like a second heart. Unlike other young Bolsheviks who bonded in idealism, Stalin's friendships were transactional. Affection felt like vulnerability, and vulnerability felt like death. Yet even in this guarded world, the Okhrana's presence grew like a dark stain. They infiltrated meetings, bribed landlords, followed couriers, copied keys. Stalin often sensed that someone was watching him, even in empty rooms. He began sitting with his back to walls. He spoke sparingly, and when he did speak, he measured every word like it could explode. During secret gatherings, he was always the last to arrive and the first to leave. The others called him quiet, serious, reserved. They didn't know that he was practicing survival. They didn't see how he was slowly shaping his mind into something sharper and colder than anyone around him. The cat-and-mouse game intensified in Baku, the oil-soaked underworld where Stalin honed the skills that would one day define his rule. Baku was chaos, fire from refineries lighting the night sky, gangs of workers fighting for scraps, revolutionaries hiding between warehouses. It was a perfect place for men who needed to vanish. Here, Stalin learned to forge passports that fooled trained agents, to code letters so that even if intercepted, they were meaningless, to disguise his voice and mannerisms, depending on the audience. It was in Baku that he first practiced emotional camouflage, a method of turning on warmth like a switch and turning it off just as quickly. He told the workers what they needed to hear, the smugglers what would make them trust him, the intellectuals what would make them believe he understood them. The Okhrana hated men like him, not because they were dangerous now, but because they could become dangerous later. But no game of deception, no matter how intricate, lasts forever. One cold evening, as Stalin walked toward a workers' meeting behind a shuttered warehouse, he sensed it. Something wrong with the night. Silence, too perfect. Shadows, too still. He paused, and in that pause came years of instinct. Run. He dodged down an alley just as two Okhrana agents stepped onto the street he had been about to cross. He heard the scrape of their boots, the click of a lantern being raised, and he pressed himself into the damp wall, holding his breath as they passed so close he could have touched their coats. The encounter shook him, not because he almost got caught, but because he realized they were no longer just monitoring him. They were hunting him. And in that moment of tightening fear, the seeds of his future paranoia were watered. Stalin told no one about the near arrest. He kept it buried, feeding off the lesson it taught him. Danger hides in stillness. Soon after, the Okhrana struck harder. A trusted courier, a man who had carried messages for the Bolsheviks for years, vanished. His body was never found, but the Okhrana had ways of extracting information from the living that made corpses unnecessary. Stalin watched as panic rippled through the underground. Men who had been bold became timid. Meetings were canceled, plans unraveled. The revolution suddenly felt fragile, like a spider web pulled too tight. This was the moment Stalin truly hardened. To him, fear was a weakness that could infect a movement and destroy it from within. And so he began doing something the others secretly found unnerving. He showed no fear. Where comrades trembled, he stayed steady. Where others doubted, he insisted the work continue. But inside, something cracked. He began scanning every face for signs of betrayal. Every handshake felt like a test. Every comrade was a potential confessor under torture. Stalin told himself this was strategy, but it was becoming who he was. The Okhrana dug deeper into his world, planting informants in taverns, tailing men who seemed unimportant, interrogating landlords about unfamiliar lodgers. Stalin responded by becoming even more difficult to trace. He changed names weekly. At times, he convinced even his closest allies that he had left the city, only to reappear suddenly at dawn to issue new orders. The secret police became obsessed with his unpredictability. Their reports described him as a ghost, a shape, a man defined more by absence than presence. The more they tried to map him, the more he slipped through their fingers. But each escape tightened his paranoia. He began sleeping lightly, waking at the smallest creak. He moved beds in the middle of the night. He studied the floorboards of safehouses for signs of recent footsteps. Slowly, the boundaries between caution and obsession began to blur. One night, during a secret meeting, Stalin noticed something strange. A comrade he had trusted for years, a small man with nervous eyes, kept touching his collar, again and again, as if adjusting something beneath his shirt. Stalin watched the movement with an intensity that made the man shrink. When the meeting ended, Stalin left quietly, but the gesture burned in his mind. A hidden wire? A concealed note? A signal? There was no proof, no confession, no arrest. But the seed was planted. By morning, Stalin had convinced himself that the man might be an informant. The Okhrana had not captured Stalin that night, but they had captured something else. His ability to believe in people. And in the absence of belief, he built suspicion. In later years, he would eliminate men based on far less evidence. But this was the beginning. The moment trust became a threat and suspicion became safety. The final push in Stalin's transformation came during another near arrest in Baku. He had been hiding in a cramped attic above a bakery, aware that the Okhrana were sweeping the neighborhood. Hours passed in suffocating stillness as he listened to murmuring agents below. He pressed his ear to the wooden boards and heard one of them discussing dossiers. "Dzhugashvili," the man said, "is becoming a problem." The voice carried a casual certainty, the kind used when speaking of a trapped animal, not a man. Stalin felt something cold unfurl inside him. It wasn't fear anymore. It was clarity. If the Empire saw him as a problem, then he would become one. If they believed he was a threat, then he would learn to be one. When the agents finally left and Stalin crawled out of the attic, he walked into the night with a new expression. Not anxiety, not caution, but a kind of quiet, calculating resolve. When Stalin finally escaped Baku, it was not as the same man who had arrived. He no longer saw people as comrades or friends. They were categories, Useful, dangerous, temporary, replaceable. The Okhrana had taught him that any person could become a doorway through which danger entered. And so he learned to close every doorway. The world of his youth, of laughter in the streets of Tiflis, of poetry, of idealistic debates, became distant, irrelevant, almost childish. He felt himself shedding layers of softness like an animal growing into a harder shell. And as he hardened, he also became more cunning. He spoke less, but listened more. He gave orders without revealing motives. He began to practice secrecy not as a necessity, but as a philosophy. What people didn't know, they couldn't betray. Years later, when Stalin ruled the Soviet Union with icy authority, people wondered how a man could become so ruthless, so paranoid, so willing to see enemies in every shadow. They wondered where the darkness began, but the truth was this. It began long before power. It began in the narrow streets where footsteps echoed behind him, in the attics where he listened for the whisper of boots, in the secret meetings where comrades swallowed their fear, in the silent rooms where he stared at the door, waiting for it to burst open. The Okhrana did not create Stalin's cruelty, but they sharpened it. They did not plant his paranoia, but they watered it. They did not turn him into a tyrant, but they taught him the value of fear. And so, when he finally took power, he ruled the way he had survived, by making every shadow heavier, every silence sharper, every person either useful or gone.